Today on The Right Angle, I'm going to be showing you one of the fundamental skills that every woodworker should know. And if you like content like this, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button as well as that notification bell so you can get information like this coming your way. So what am I talking about when I say the one fundamental skill that every woodworker should know? Well, I'm talking about the milling process, or in other words, the 8 steps of squaring. Now, having square and flat lumber is vital in making sure to have a nice fit and finish of any project. Failure to do this will lead to major headaches as well as the development of a new vocabulary that you didn't know existed. Now, I know there are many different ways for this process to be done. I'm just going to be showing you the process that I learned through my education at Cerritos College. Hopefully I can do this system justice as well as give you guys the tools to build with more confidence. Now I'm going to list out the 8 steps in order as well as show each of the steps in more detail. Step 1. Crosscut lumber to rough length plus an inch or 2. Step 2. Flatten one face of the lumber with the concave side down or whichever side is most stable. Step 3. Plane unfinished face parallel to the flattened face. Step 4. Joint edge flat and square to the face board using a joiner. Step 5. Rip board to width plus 1/32 of an inch. Step 6. Joint ripped edge on jointer. This only applies if you ripped the edge final length plus 32. Step 7. Cut best end square on the table saw or chop saw. And finally, step 8. Cut opposite ends square into final length using the table saw or chop saw. Alright, so to demonstrate the 8 steps of squaring, I found this 8/4 walnut that we'll use for the demonstration. Now, in the first step, we start with the radial arm saw. Here, we're going to cross cut the lumber to rough length plus an inch or 2. Now, before we make that cut, I want to give you a few safety tips to keep in mind when making the cut. First up, you want to make sure that the edge of the board and the fence where they meet, there's no gap at the cut line. This will ensure that the blade doesn't get pinched. Next, you want to make sure that the distance between the edge of this board and the blade are clear. That way the blade has plenty of time to get up to speed before pulling into the stock, as well as making sure that the blade doesn't start on the wood, which can cause other problems. Next one up is making sure that the hand that's securing the wood against the fence is a minimum of about 6 inches away from the center line of the blade. And then as well as to make sure that your thumb stays tucked in and away from the blade. Now the last thing is making sure to have a stable base. Now based on how the radial arm saw blade is set up, it's actually doing a climb cut, which means that the blade is going to want to pull up, out, and towards you. So in the case of the radial arm saw, you want to make sure that you have a stable base with your hand securing the lumber against the fence, and then you're going to control the rate of feed by pulling the blade slowly through the stock and then returning it back to its starting position, and there you have it. You're good to go. So step 2, we're going to flatten one face, preferably the concave side or whichever side is most stable. Now, before we make that cut, I have a few safety tips to keep in mind. 1, we want to make sure to keep our fingers at least 6 inches away from the blade, just like the radial arm saw. We also want to make sure to keep consistent pressure both on the in-feed and out-feed table, not applying too much pressure which would cause to remove the warp or the issue that we're trying to correct, but to keep a nice even pressure so that you get a nice clean cut with the blade. Now, something to keep in mind, you always want to have these available. I have a push block or a push stick. Now with a joiner, usually you're looking at about a 1/16 to a 32nd of thickness being removed. I like to sit around 1/32. Now with edge jointing on the jointer, you want to make sure that any pieces that are shorter than the fence height, you make sure you use a push stick to keep your fingers up and away from the blade. Alright, now we're on step 3. Here we're going to take the unfinished end and plane this parallel to the surface that we just flattened on the jointer. Now to do this, I've got here a DeWalt thickness planer where I'm going to set for the thickest part of the wood. I'm going to make sure to keep my eyes and fingers far away from the opening, as well as remove about a 32nd of an inch per pass, no more than that. Now that we've flattened and paralleled both surfaces, we're going to joint one edge of the board flat and square to the face. Step 5, we're going to rip the board to final width plus a 32nd of an inch. Now this part is the optional part of the 8 steps. Now if you cut proud 32nd of an inch, I have my joiner set at a 32nd of an inch cut. So I usually rip to width plus a 32nd, and then I clean it up on the joiner, removing any burn marks and getting a nice clean finish. Now this is totally optional, and if you want to cut to your final width here at the table saw, then you can do so. Before we make that cut, I'm going to give you guys a few safety tips to keep in mind. First off, you want to make sure that the blade is at least a 1/4 inch above the stock that you're cutting. Next, you want to make sure that you have a good solid balance and that you're applying pressure. You're keeping your left hand down and away from the blade, as well as pushing through and towards the fence to keep the board from binding or possibly giving you kickback. Now, anytime you're cutting or ripping anything 6 inches or less, you want to make sure to use a push stick, which in my case today, I'll be using a push stick because I'm cutting about 4 inches or so, maybe 4.5 inches. So just things to keep in mind, and we're ready to cut. Step 6. Now this only applies if you ended up cutting the piece like I did, a 32nd of an inch wider than the final width. Now if you cut exactly to this width, then this step's not necessary, but in my case it is. So I'm going to run over to the joiner and I'm going to joint the edge that I just cut on the table saw. Now we're on to step 7. We're going to cut the best end square using a table saw or a chop saw. Now before making the cut, as we all know, a lot of the same safety tips and tricks that I was showing you guys with the table saw apply here with the chop saw. Making sure to keep our fingers at least 6 inches away from the center line of the chop saw, keeping nice firm pressure up and against the fence, as well as making sure that there's no gap between the edge of the board and the fence. Doing this will make sure you get a nice clean cut. You also want to make sure that you let the blade get to full speed before pulling through the stock and then returning to its start position. Last but not least, step 8. We're going to cut the opposing end square into final length. And there you have it. We've got a nice square, flat, parallel piece of 8/4 walnut ready for the next step in the process.